So we will start. So I want to thank everybody for being here. First of all, everything is being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, you have to switch off your video and don't not say anything. And I certainly have to thank Phil Wood, who will try to keep order. I hope it's not necessary. So there's 1 hour for the interview approximately, and then 1 hour to introduce everybody a little bit. But well, approximately we won't be very strict.
John Guzet is here.
Hey.
Okay. So as I said, it will be about his book, The Viennese Socrates. As I said, I'm not a very good interviewer because I agree too much with him. It's a book, well, I've looked at it, it's an incredible work. You worked 2 decades on it, I think?
Yes.
20 years, it's incredible. I can see that it was a lot of work. I become tired only of thinking, just thinking about it makes me feel tired.
I'm very indecisive, so you know, should have made a commitment earlier.
So, but I will tell you something that I always say, and then you will tell me I'm wrong. I always tell people that Popper was not a libertarian, but you write that he was a libertarian from the left. But can you explain this? Because okay.
Oh, so I mean, I don't think we should use that term for him, but that we want, but there is an interpretation that could claim Popper for a libertarian left. That's really what I'm. So I suppose that's really what I was saying, rather than saying that he himself would describe himself in those terms.
Okay. So because on the one hand, he wanted the state to protect the weak, because that's something else you say before I give the word to our friend John there. You write, you wrote that about the protection principle for the minorities, for the weak, for the protection of the individual rights, and you connect this with what you have here, sovereignty, the society without a sovereign power. Huh? And can you explain this? Because the dots in the beginning, because of Brexit, we've heard a lot about sovereignty. You can explain something here that is completely different now.
Well, to some extent, well, I'm not sure that it would not have been said before, but to some extent, I think Popper sees sovereignty as a myth or a paradox, and that the key concern with sovereignty is that it is usually advanced as a claim to absolute power, unchecked, unconstrained power, and it can be most typically associated with a claim of who should rule, who should have jurisdiction over a particular territory and over a particular group of people. So we start with a rejection of the who should rule question. We start with a rejection of the claim that any state or any system of government has an unchallengeable right to rule a particular territory. We therefore reject not only monarchical claims and aristocratic claims to rule, but also the claims of nation states and the nationality principle to be unchecked. So what Popper would suggest, for example, with the rise of self-determination in so-called national self-determination, I should say, in Central Europe after the First World War in particular, is that this self-determination by a dominant national group within a particular territory often left exposed various ethnic minorities within that territory. And just look at the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and what you see is the Czechoslovakia contained all sorts of interesting minorities who then felt oppressed or marginalized or unable to hold central powers to account. So sovereignty is problematic. It should always be checked by other factors or other forces. With respect to Brexit, I mean, you have this delicious system where you have the rejection of probably the most successful peace project that has existed in a very long while, the European Union. Britain has withdrawn from that. I think by withdrawing, it may actually destabilize the whole, which is it's very unfortunate, but it also potentially destabilizes Britain because Scotland and the Scottish nationalists, for example, might equally advance a claim, and if we have Scottish national independence, then I would imagine the Shetlanders and the Orkney Islands might also have some concern about possible autonomy and possible separation. Where do you end with those claims? So there's the myth of sovereignty there, but then there is also the myth of sovereignty in a democratic society, the idea that the majority should rule, and that is something which perhaps we can discuss more extensively. But so you have specifically with regard to the Brexit situation, there you have this interesting. So it's like one of those Russian eggs where you open up one and you have yet others within it. From Popper's point of view, some form of international federation, some form of international, transnational checks and balances is necessary so that no state is truly sovereign or self-contained. And I see Jeremy has said, oh yes, the Scottish nationalists wish to rejoin the EU, and that will set a very interesting circumstance for the EU, because what about Catalonia? What about the various regions within Belgium that might also seek separation? And if the EU endorses sovereignty in one area, or separate secessionism and sovereignty, and then prior to admission to the Union, does it then have to advance that elsewhere? Of course, there is a very nice set of arguments for a Europe of regions rather than a Europe of nations, but that's one of the things I think which most irritated the Brexiteers.
The problem is, where do you end the splitting? And that's Jeremy wrote about. But now, okay, we go to John. John Rock, you are allowed to ask your question.
Actually, no, it was just a desire because people were talking about Hegel before. I was going to ask. It's a bit of a change, but let's stick to the same topic. Yeah, you were talking about the EU. What do you make of these efforts to try to get the EU to kind of break up? Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of campaigning for Brexit. There's a lot of forces pushing the nationalists in France. A lot of it comes from the Russian side. A lot of it came from the Donald Trump side. Thankfully, that's not happening anymore. But what do you make of these interests that would really are very interested in seeing the European Union break up? What's their long-term, let's say, agenda in that regard?
Their long-term agenda? I have no idea what their long-term agenda is. I can't get into their head and can't second guess what seems to me a position that I do not sympathize with. But clearly there are problems. There are massive problems with the EU itself. There is what political scientists laughably call a democratic deficit in the EU. The European Parliament is weak, ineffectual, cannot initiate legislation, has only recently, well, since 2009, effectively acquired the ability even to hold the Commission to account. I mean, and individual commissioners. You had some earlier occasions where the entire Commission was forced to resign, but it has never effectively, the European Parliament, which is the only directly elected component within the EU governmental structure, there's no exact occasion when the EU Parliament has been able to effectively dismiss the Commission or the chief, the president of the EU Commission. As I say, there has been a resignation prior to a resolution of lack of confidence, but not otherwise. So there's this massive deficit in the EU in terms of its own internal structures. But then there is also the unpleasant contest as to which legal system should predominate, and there is some advantage to very slow accommodation and adjustment of the different legal systems within the EU. In terms of English nationalism, there was we have the common law, that sort of view, whereas the Europeans were imposing a kind of codified top-down so it was argued, view and interpretive mechanisms. So there's a number of issues that are tied in here, but and then there is the illusion that Brexit would achieve greater liberty. I do not see Brexit as achieving greater liberty for the Brits. I see that it is a massive loss, and it's a lose-lose proposition as far as I can see. The EU has also greatly been diminished and weakened as a result, but the EU is founded on at least the 4 freedoms of the single market, and it has also quite recently adopted a Charter of Fundamental Rights that is modeled on the European Convention of Human Rights, and the EU systems could conceivably, therefore, hold to account the different member states and the institutions of the EU more effectively through its own Court of Justice, through the EU Court of Justice. But anyway, those are issues there. But I cannot entirely get into the minds of the Brexiteers. I think Jeremy has greater perspective on this, but there we are.
Jeremy, do you want to say something about? Yes.
Yeah, let Jeremy go first, yeah, please.
You have to unmute yourself, Jeremy.
Yes, sorry, I'm having difficulty doing it. I just wanted to ask you how you're wanting to organize this. That's to say, are you planning really to have
the advantage is to the people who want to ask questions. Yes, I want interaction.
Okay,
yeah.
Well, if it's acceptable, I'd just like to make a couple of, I mean, I'd be happy to talk about Europe, but I'd be happier if we could actually talk about Philip's book. And yes. I just wonder if I can pose a couple of points directly about that.
Yes, do it.
Okay. First of all, I'd say Philip gives what I think is a really interesting interpretation of Popper, and it is the kind of interpretation which will warm the hearts of those who I think want to take Popper in a broadly social democrat direction. I think this is a very reasonable interpretation of Popper, and I think that although I think that it is a terrible view to uphold, I think that it is a view which is much closer to Popper than have been attempts to claim that he is some sort of libertarian or some sort of Hayekian. But I think there is an important mistake in the book, and there are some problems. The mistake I take to be this: Philip brings out respects in which Popper's views have a strong continuity with revisionist interpretations of Marxism. He then waxes eloquent about Marxism and participatory democracy. And I think all of that is right, but it seems to me what he doesn't really do, unless I've missed this, is to face the fact that Popper himself accorded only a very limited role to democracy. I mean, basically, Popper was a theorist of criticism. He was a theorist who advocated the ability of democratic electorates to get rid of Parliament. But it seems to me that the picture that Philip conjures up, and which some other people seem to share, of a glorifying of a sort of participatory democracy, doesn't seem to me really to be found in Popper at all, and which I think is all to the good, because I think it is an absurdity.
Do you want me to jump in after each point, or would you rather
they're connected?
Okay,
they're connected. Okay. Second, and I'm very sympathetic to this, Popper accords a protectionist role to the state. But the problem is that he has really no theory of the state. I mean, it's a little bit like my according a protectionist role to tigers, which is that it would be very nice if they would do it, but where I mean, the Open Society is in a sense almost free of political science, in the sense of an account of what the mechanisms would actually be like.
Could you allow me to butt in?
Well, can I just make the interconnected points and then I'll start? Philip, I think, significantly points to the importance of the criticisms, particularly made by Hayek, of Marxian ideas about essentially the ability of socialism just to be able to take over an operational market economy and just enjoy its benefits, but where one gets rid of markets. But it seems to me that he falls down in terms of then looking at, well, what are the consequences of this? And in particular, what are the consequences of having a market economy in place in terms of that imposing restrictions on what else you can do within such a polity? And one could add to this, and at this point I'll conclude, that there is, particularly in Hayek's law, legislation, and liberty, a kind of matching discussion of the problems facing democracy by the operation of interest groups. And so in a sense, what I would say, and this is why all these things are connected together, the problem for me about the stuff that Philip picks up on is that Popper essentially wants the government to be able to do various kinds of things, but doesn't, in a sense, take seriously what I would see as there being structural limitations on what can be done politically once you have a well-functioning market economy in place, and doesn't address at all the problems, parallel ones, of structural limitations imposed on what you can do once you choose one kind of political system or another. So it's for that reason that I think the book is very good, but what worries me about it is you're, in a sense, not just following, but going further than Popper in an uncritical enthusiasm for what, from your perspective, comes close to participatory democracy.
Joseph, Yossi, do you mind if I jump in with an answer directly to Jeremy, or would it be better for you to go first? You sure? Thank you. Okay, so if I may, Jeremy, number one, regarding participatory democracy, chapter 8 of my book tries to include a discussion of that. I recognize indeed that Popper had a very limited view of democracy, and I think in fact his 1988 essay is even worse than his earlier limited view on democracy. It is deeply disappointing to me. He did not consider the various options that might exist in a democracy for the recall by voters, for example, of a representative, or for voter initiatives, or for indeed, of course, the focus of much of what he writes in the 1988 article, that had wide distribution, by the way, is a criticism of proportional representation. I think he entirely misses a key component of the debate about proportional representation, and I'm conscious of the fact that Lani Guinier in the United States has just died, a previous prominent champion of a more proportional representative system here in the States. But in terms of what you had in the debate in Britain, the debate was not about the very things that Popper was dismissive about. The debate at the time in Britain focused on single transferable voting systems that would indeed do exactly what Popper claimed a PR system would not do. So he was resistant to any improvement in democratic accountability, and I think that is very disappointing in Popper. He does not seem to have become a champion of the incorporation of human rights law in systems. So there's a variety of ways in which Popper was deficient, and where, especially towards the end of his writings, he becomes significantly less aligned with a view that I would favor. Although there are some interesting eccentricities even at the end. I mean, he has the view, he makes a comment in one of his last interviews about abortion rights and says, the Pope will come round. I mean, he has an interesting, very strange set of views towards the end. Let me, if I may turn, before Yossi comes in, if I may turn to the protectionism question. Yes, a market economy does no doubt restrain protectionism insofar as you want a market economy, and insofar as the market economy minimizes human suffering. I mean, so far, if the goal that one of the goals that we're aiming at is to minimize misery and to reduce the suffering, in particular the proletariat, the largest number of people who are exposed in a market economy to possible suffering, then I think we always evaluate the market economy in terms of whether it is indeed minimizing misery, or whether it is in some of its operations, and one might argue in all of its operations, actually ultimately causing greater distress and greater misery. But yes, so you have a market economy. The market economy seems remarkably capable of supporting innovation, and as part of that innovative process, sometimes less innovative firms are killed off. And in the process of killing off those firms, there is deep distress. There is unemployment, there is impoverishment, there is foreclosure on mortgaged homes, and there's all sorts of other distresses that occur in a market economy that a open society ought not to be blind and deaf towards. It ought to be committed in a humanitarian way, and this is, I think, what Popper was saying in, at least in 1945, it ought to be committed to intervening to minimize distress if it wants to still preserve a market economy. And there are good reasons for preserving a market economy, especially in the absence of a free and feasible version of socialism, for want of a better term. So you want to preserve the market economy. I'm not sure that I can't quite be sure where you think I was going with my alignment of Popper and the revisionist Marxists such as Bernstein, and the Braunthal brothers, by the way, as well, who were very close connected to Popper. I think Popper's emergence from that revisionist socialist, revisionist Marxist position is important. He may not acknowledge it in the open society. In fact, he only
he did.
Only briefly. There's one minor reference to Bernstein, and he even gives the wrong initial for Bernstein.
No, he said, of course, I would be all for socialism, had I thought it possible.
Yes, if it was compatible with liberty, right? Yes. Yes. I think I have recognized various deficiencies with Marxism. It's not an uncritical enthusiasm. So I would suggest that, Jeremy. And if one last point, if I may, before I hand over to Yossi, is you say I want to develop Popper in an uncritical direction where, or at least go beyond Popper. My goodness, what the heck are we saying here? I mean, is Popper the end of the road? Is it the end of history and we can then retire and stop thinking critically and be inventive of better solutions? I think not, Jeremy. I think we should indeed question Popper, try to find out where he was wrong, because he almost certainly was wrong in many, many areas that we have yet to identify, and indeed improve upon his theory. I see no contradiction between being enthusiastic in recognizing Popper's contribution and wanting to go beyond him. Maybe Yossi wants to come in, I think, first.
I want to say a few things. First of all, the weakest part of Popper's political philosophy is his attitude to women and Jews. There's no question about it. He said they should be grateful for the achievements they have, which I think is condescending and mistaken. When you have achievements, you should use them to make more achievements. And there is a limit to the achievement, and it is total equality. We don't speak of the rights of commoners as opposed to aristocrats. This is gone. And the attitude to aristocrats should be emulated by attitudes to women and Jews and other minorities that are suffering discrimination. That's first of all. Secondly, the great thing about Popper's philosophy, and people don't notice it, is that his program is minimalist. That is, he wished to call a Democrat anybody whom he can possibly call a Democrat. I think this is as laudable as it comes. I think both intellectually and politically, this is wonderful to be a minimalist in your demands from the others. And what he demanded is that we can correct our mistakes to some extent without bloodshed. Now, it looks obvious what is with and what is without bloodshed, but the dividing line is not so clear. So there's a lot of possibility of discussion, dissent, and so on, even within the Popperian camp, as noticed by John Wetterstein and so on. If we acknowledge that Popper tried to be minimalist, then we can ask how successful he was. But I think the effort to be minimalist is itself laudable as such. Thank you.
Can I just respond about Jews and women? I certainly, I think, with regard to women, there is very little reference, very little recognition of women and women's contributions. It is a remarkably male-centered view of history that he presents, I think. And he barely acknowledges, at least in the published writings, his wife's massive contribution and sacrifice.
In his autobiography, he mentions it.
Right. Yes, that's true. But in terms of Jews, that's because I know of your writings on liberal nationalism and liberal Zionism in particular. Popper was very clearly, at least as far as I can tell, not a Zionist, not anti-Zionist. Yes, he was anti-nationalist, including anti-Jewish nationalism, Zionism. And I respect his position. I think actually that is a position I will agree with on that. I'm not in favor of Zionism or indeed of other forms of nationalism.
It would interest you to know that I told him that for me the discussion about Zionism is just as a discussion of the War of the Roses. And in response he said all Israelis should be given green cards and they will all go to America. Well,
yes. So I wouldn't take that view either. But
I'm just reporting.
Just in terms of the establishment of the state in the 1940s, I think that was and it is consistent with his view that national self-determination after the First World War was also a mistake. I think there is always a problem that you create new minorities within the borders, and indeed in the case of Israel, you arguably lead to a mass exodus of individuals who were resident there. But not getting into that, which, but in terms of his attitude to Judaism, I was taught by Shimon Abransky for one of my classes, and I understand that Popper initiated a lawsuit against Abransky because Abransky was writing a celebration of Jewish intellectual contributions, and he wanted to include Popper, and Popper did not want to be identified as a Jewish intellectual. He seems to be very, very conscious of a desire to separate himself from any group identity.
He and Gombrich together.
Mm.
And indeed, Schumann respected his decision.
Well, yes. Yes, I agree. He interesting character, Abramsky himself, but one of the few anti-Stalinists who actually had to be expelled from the Communist Party. He didn't leave of his own accord when in the 1950s. But anyway, let's have I answered that? And I see Jeremy has an interest in coming back, and I think there was another hand that I saw a moment ago as well.
Adnan, I think.
Yeah,
Adnan,
it's me.
yes.
Yeah, may I ask? So, according to my knowledge, the Popper between revolution and reform choose reform to change the governments without bloodshed. But I think it's a kind of even I criticize this idea in my MA thesis because I think that when we have, for example, 15 ministry in a government, 30 of these ministries are corrupted. I think we have to make a kind of revolution to change this government, because reform cannot do things better in this situation. But if you have 15 ministry, and in these 15, 2 or 3 ministries are corrupted, we can make a reform in such a reform in this situation. And don't you think it's a lack of ideas about in Popper's mind?
So Popper himself was not opposed to revolution in all circumstances. If you have a tyranny,
he said he supported tyranny. This is a quote.
Well, I have come across that in limited circumstances if a tyranny also produces an open society. But in his open society, and his enemies, he doesn't write that. He writes instead that if you cannot achieve peaceful change of government, if that is his definition of a tyranny at that point, and at that point he suggests that one does indeed need to use violence as a lever for change. I happen to think that that was all that Marx was also talking about, by the way. I don't think Marx was an advocate of violent revolution if you have peaceful and constitutional mechanisms. And indeed, Marx, like Popper, advocated democracy. And once you have democracy, you have the prospect of peaceful change. And in, for example, Marx's speech in the Netherlands at The Hague in 1872, at the conclusion of Congress of the International Working Men's Association, he makes that point clear, that in England and in the United States and in a number of other countries where there was constitutional representative systems, there a peaceful and constitutional path forward is to be expected. So there we have that. So you may well, if you have corruption to the point where peaceful change is impossible, then clearly in those circumstances you do not have what even the minimal definition of democracy might suggest. And in those circumstances, some other lever for changing power might exist, according to Popper. I myself would be entirely risk averse, so I would not be inclined to pursue that. But does that answer your question or your observation there?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Philip, just a slight caveat. You said that you should overthrow it, but only in order to install a democracy.
Yes.
That only up until that point.
Are we talking in terms of for Popper? Yes, for Popper, if you do not have a democratic system in the minimalist definition that Yossi mentioned, the democracy minimally is a set of institutions centered on the rule of law, which permits peaceful change from government to another government when the majority so choose, for want of a better term.
I just want to add a small thing about corruption. My experience is I've been in some of the countries in Eastern Europe after the fall of communism, where, for instance,
Thank you
the
very
mailman
much.
couldn't earn his living. He had to ask money to deliver the letter, or he didn't get it, because otherwise he would die of starvation. All the policemen were corrupt. Of course, if there was one policeman who was not corrupt, he died. So, but this is very difficult to get rid of. Once it is in a society, it's everywhere, and everybody accepts it because it's impossible to survive otherwise. And once you have it, it's very difficult to eradicate. And I don't think a revolution will solve this. So it's very difficult.
And the rule of law is centrally missing in those circumstances. So, yeah.
Yes. And Popper was very good in this, about what he wrote about Eastern Europe, that they changed everything too quickly without having laws and without having anything in place, and everything was destroyed. The whole economy was destroyed, agriculture was destroyed, and nothing was left. They had to start from scratch. That was a terrible disaster, actually. Okay.
He sees it, yeah, with the absence of an incorruptible judiciary and enforcement. You have looting of state assets by the oligarchs. And,
I remember, yes, they told me in Bulgaria, they want to privatize the airways, the planes, and the, how do they call this, the place where the airplanes come and land and so on. And somebody bought it for a small amount of money from the state. He sold all the planes. He made a big profit, and he said, "Oh well, I'm not interested in the business anymore." These things happened there. It was incredible. They just filled their pockets in the most terrible way. And now we go back to Jeremy, I think. Okay, Jeremy,
Okay.
you had another question?
Well, I wanted to respond to what Philip was saying before. My claim was not that one shouldn't criticize and improve on Popper, but that Philip was trying to do it in utterly the wrong direction. And the heart of it, and I mean, clearly I can say only the tiniest little bit about this now, but I mean, I start to despair about this because I've written a couple of books about it and no one really seems to engage with the argument. But the key thing isn't about markets being wonderful and so on, so much as that a key argument in Hayek is that if you can't actually work a socialized economy, you need to have a market-based economy in place. And this, if it's going to operate, effectively has some structural features, which if you try and muck around with them in inappropriate ways, then produce dysfunctional consequences. And so I mean, Hayek is himself someone who, I mean, he's not wildly enthusiastic about it, but he is certainly someone who favors a welfare state. But his big argument is you have to operate it in ways that are compatible with the good functioning of a market economy. And the problem for me about Popper's silence, and then about what happens beyond Popper in terms of greater enthusiasm for democratic interventionism, is that people don't take seriously the notion that there may be constraints on what you can actually do by way of piecemeal social engineering, and that it gets us back, as it were, to a Platonic problem. I mean, namely, the more you simply open things up to people's opinions, unconstrained by such tentative knowledge as we've got, which is obviously fallible, the more you're likely to get into certain kinds of populism, which gave us the joys of Brexit, which gave us the joys that are currently wrecking the American political system on both sides. So it isn't an argument that nothing should be done in terms of bad consequences of markets. It's more one of saying, take seriously what having a market economy and what having any particular kind of democratic system involves in terms then of the constraints that it imposes on what we can otherwise sensibly do. That was the argument.
Okay. Well, I think your argument was made very effectively in your book, both your book on Popper's politics and in the contributions that many libertarian, in the American sense, libertarian theorists have advanced in favor of free markets. By the way, my initial understanding of libertarianism, when back before I had encountered the American brand, was that it was a form of anti-state or minimal state socialism or left-wing view. So I had encountered libertarian socialists and libertarian communists before I had been introduced to the variety that has that label in the States and now elsewhere. But I think Popper recognizes that there are limits to interventionism. He very clearly claims that we should assess the unforeseen consequences of a policy, that's why he wants any intervention to be piecemeal, to be gradual, to be capable of being assessed and appraised, and for inconveniences, for want of a better term, to become apparent, and such that therefore that the policy may be altered or withdrawn. So he is aware that there are constraints on that, and it may well be that an intervention so hampers the market that the market is unable to deliver in a decentralized and efficient and liberty enhancing way such goods as one sees from the market. But so I think Popper was aware of that. He didn't spell out in great detail, but certainly there have been a number of libertarians, including, or a number of Popperian scholars, including yourself, that have made that case quite effectively. And I think today, in fact, the libertarian in the American sense approach to Popper is far more the dominant approach than my own. Forgive me for raising a small, still voice for a kind of left-wing Popper, but there it is. I am in a minority among those who are Popper supporters, I think. But there we are. I will raise that argument. But Jeremy, I think you wanted to come back again on that. So
only just to say, the argument that I'm offering is, I would see as being a Hayekian one, not a libertarian one. And the key thing, it seems to me, is that, I mean, Popper, for example, when in The Poverty of Historicism, he referred to Hayek's arguments about knowledge.
Yes.
And he said, well, effectively, the piecemeal social engineers need to take this knowledge into account. But there is within the open society no institutional mechanism for taking our best knowledge into account as a constraint on what people might want to clamor for. And one's had in the last few years, I mean, particularly, I just start to despair of things given social media, a kind of freeing up of unconstrained opinions. And by unconstrained, I mean unconstrained by such knowledge as we tentatively have and by the need to improve on it. and to take, if we can't, to take it seriously as a constraint on what we should wish for. And this seems to me to be the big problem for, as it were, the social democrat reading of Popper. On the other hand, I think the social democrats are dead right in terms of what Popper's own approach and intentions were, and that people who want to make of Popper a libertarian are completely wrong.
Jeremy, I mean, an ethic of self-restraint is what is needed, but that is something that, in fact, is undermined by a market economy and by the proponents of market economy, who see self-restraint as often an inhibition on that. So if I may suggest that Popper does, at least in his private musings, talk about the need for an ethic of self-restraint, not least in terms of limiting the population of the world and our consumption and our preferences for intellectual engagement, a Socratic life. He wrote to Isaiah Berlin, for example, in that exchange of letters that we have. But I think sorry, was that? So I think there is a recognition. But the other thing, Jeremy, if I may ask, who is this we that you keep talking about? I mean, you're saying that surely the deliberative space of society, of a democracy, is exactly where some discussion of and some criticism of demands for piecemeal engineering might properly emerge. And you can't specify how that is going to occur. I mean, Popper could not have foreseen the internet and the social media, which has opened up discussion spaces, not always resulting in desirable discussion, but sometimes doing so. And we are developing precisely the democratic mechanisms for dialogue, for discussion, for deliberation on what we can do, both in terms of achieving greater justice in society, but also in terms of enhancing liberty in society. And there isn't simply the market prescription and nothing else. We have to be able to criticize this and move beyond this.
But I think each time I refer to Hayek, you talk about what seems to me to be a fantasy market perspective. Hayek's work is all about how we can impose necessary self-constraints on us, institutional constraints. And if you want my answer as to where deliberation really needs to take place, it would be essentially in an improved House of Lords, where to which people are appointed on a basis which represents different particular significant social interests, but in a setting where they're committed to actually deliberating with one another. And so from this point of view, I would commend Hegel's philosophy of right. And at this point, I'll stop.
Okay, now Adam Smilewski hasn't been able to ask a question. He's been, yes, Adam?
Two brief questions. Both are addressed to Philip. Karl Popper came to London, to Great Britain, at the time when you had introduced the social liberal arrangements by William Beveridge, right? This is the beginning of the social state. Did it have any influence on Popper? He must have been a beneficiary to some extent of these arrangements. That's one question. Second question, I would like to come back briefly to this thing that was brought up by Joseph. I mean, to this astounding, shocking solution to the Jewish problem. Forgive me the expression, because Popper had this solution to this Jewish problem, and in his autobiography he says that the problem would be dissolved, so to speak, by itself if the Jews had completely given up their Jewish identity when I read it, I was really flabbergasted because, you see, I live in a country which was a venue of the Holocaust, and we are still reworking this trauma, because it was not only the extermination of Jews, but it is a problem for us until today, and it will continue to be so for decades to come. And I was just astonished to read that in Popper, who was trying to give up on his Jewish identity as much as he could, even though Hakohen, when he wrote this big biography, he had done a lot of work on Popper's Jewishness, something that Popper wanted to deny. And do you have any view on this problem?
Well, are you asking me or are you asking Yossi, Joseph?
Both of you, I guess.
So can I take the first question, then come to that? So the first question was beverage and the influence on Popper. I think Popper was very influenced by beverage and the prequel, so to speak, and by the New Deal in the United States, and by the various other responses that we see in the 1930s that seemed to face massive social distress as a result of market forces going awry. And so that world recession produced some very interesting innovations, and Roosevelt and the New Deal, as much as Keynes and the possible innovations in Britain, I think, were great inspirations. But if I may say, also the New Zealand experience. As I understand it, and I don't know perhaps as much as I should about the New Zealand experience, but there was a very interesting development of social welfare systems in New Zealand prior to the 1930s. So by the time when Popper arrived in New Zealand in 1930, at the end of 1938, you have this already existing model, and I think that also inspired some of Popper's views at that point. But again, let me quickly reference back to his roots in the revisionist socialist movements in Austria. So he's not exactly hostile to state moderation of market forces and of proletarian misery. Adam, does that answer that first question? Or
that's very good. Yeah, thank you.
And in terms of the Jewish question, Popper has the view that of individualism, that we should in effect abandon group identity and not cling to customary or traditional claims to rights, but rather to recognize a universal right as individuals. So I think that is the root of his hostility to what he refers to as tribalism and to other collectivist approaches, groupthink approaches to that. Now, I'm going to immediately anticipate that Joseph wants to come in, so maybe I should let him also have a You and I would disagree. And by the way, I disagree with the one area I disagree with Hakohen on is on this matter. I really like Hakohen's work, but he seems to criticize Popper as someone who was dismissive or disparaging to especially Eastern Jews and Orthodox Jews in Austria. And Hakohen almost seems to take personal offense to that, and I find that strange and puzzling.
Maybe we can go to, if Joe Agassi doesn't want to say anything.
I want very much, yes, allow
yes,
me.
okay.
Popper didn't write, but said repeatedly that the trouble with the Jews, that is a marvelous expression, the trouble with the Jews is that they thought everything they deserve, and they never have enough of what they have the right to have. Perhaps there were some people in Vienna who felt that way, but nobody identified Jews with that kind of greed. This was a special idea that Popper had. I don't know where he got it from, but he said it repeatedly. that the trouble with the Jews in Vienna was that they thought they deserved everything and they never had enough.
I haven't heard that expression from Popper, but certainly
No,
he was,
but he said it repeatedly. Also, one has to say his parents, or his father in particular, were important persons in the Jewish community in Vienna, and they baptized.
yes,
And
they
they
went to
certainly
Lutheranism.
baptized without conviction, just
Right.
like Heinrich Heine.
There is something very strange about that, though. Would you agree that to become a Lutheran in a Catholic majority society is itself an expression of difference?
When Jews went Christian, they always preferred Lutheran to Catholic, both because it was still a minority and because Lutherans appreciated the Old Testament more than the Catholics.
Right, but again, if you wish to cease to be a minority, why would you not? Anyway, doesn't matter. I'm just
yes,
puzzled
Joseph
by.
Joseph Roth, for example, became a Catholic.
Yeah, well, I mean, Wittgenstein's parents, I think, or maybe it was his grandparents that became Lutherans, and then his parents became Catholic. I can't recall.
That's right, but Wittgenstein was a mixed case, but Popper was not, so it's easier to speak about. It is no question that there is here a complex of attitudes, identities, and so on. But I must say that whenever Popper met anti-Semitism, he stood up and said, "I am a Jew." And this one has to appreciate. He never tried to bend down to anti-Semitism personally. He always fought it as best he could. Also, he treated Jewish students as best he could. Many of his students were Jews, and he really tried hard to take good care of them. Especially, he made Zolchen an assistant of his in order to support him financially, because he was a refugee. So there was a lot to say for Popper that is personal and only gossip, but still I think it counts a little bit at least.
Thank you.
Or whatever.
Can we now go to Jerome, who wants to ask a question? Jerome?
Yes, I have a lot of, well, they're not questions, more disputations. There should be a little bit more controversy here, I think, instead of the kumbaya. This goes back also to some of the prior points that were made by Jeremy in particular, who said that we must learn to live with markets. And I would just, at this point, in the interests of clarity, specify, what types of markets we're talking about. And in particular, I think the idea of distinguishing between market forces on the one hand and market transactions on the other is a very useful approach in this regard, because not every market transaction, if I go to the neighborhood shop and I buy a pack of chewing gum, is equivalent. So I think that's a useful distinction that can also help in terms of discussing issues like democracy and issues like socialism versus capitalism, which I think can also be a sort of a bullet or a boilerplate discussion that really doesn't go anywhere beyond grazing the surface. So I would also question the authority of Hayek in many of these topics, whose writing, I think, in many ways is the result of I would say, in my opinion, an irrational fear of change, and his notions of encasement of the economy, I think, are in fact quite reactionary, and yeah, I would just say wrong, and gets the problem, so to speak, wrong. It's just to sort of dispute this notion coming from Jeremy. Also, I think the lack of democracy that Philip mentioned at the beginning is a very, very important issue, and needs a lot more attention than it's received, I think, in this discussion. And I think we have the benefit of history. I like Cornelius Castoriadis' notion of imagination. I think imagination is a topic that's too under-discussed in philosophy. Maybe it sounds a little bit like soft science. I think it's not the case. In fact, I think it's one of the most distinguishing capacities that human beings actually exhibit. And in fact, I think democracy is not just a majority decisions. It is also a process of the development of, of beliefs. It's what Habermas called the, a discursive logic. And just the last point is, Jeremy suggested reading Hegel's philosophy of right. I would actually recommend Marx's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right is a much more interesting book, and I would actually say that Hegel displayed the typical sort of Enlightenment racism in his book.
Well, what's the dispute in that? I mean, you said you were going to take I mean, I agree mainly with what Jerome has said, but maybe I can take issue with your first point, because I do take issue with that. I think your distinction between market forces and market transactions is a distinction without a difference. It seems to me that what you have is a system of exchange, and a market system of exchange is a market system of exchange. It is a system acknowledging non-ownership and hence exclusion, other than on terms set by the owner, of certain other persons. Now, I don't think there is, quote, fair market transactions. I think every time you enter into a market transaction, there is inequality between the buyer and the seller. It may not always be on the same side, but is often on the same side. But I also think that the crucial point is not market transactions per se, but a particular type of buying and selling, the buying and selling, or renting, if you wish to call it that, of human labor power, of the wages system. And it seems to me that that is the crucial distinctive feature of what Marx criticized as capitalism. Marx talked about a system of wage labor and capital, and that where you have wage labor, you have capitalism. And that exists even if the capital is owned by the state and centralized in state hands. And it also, in my view, exists where you have workers' cooperatives, where the capital is owned collectively and the workers are paid, again, a wage, and have to contribute to the surplus value, the surplus labor that is accumulated in the capital. So I think that's where you and I very strongly part company. But in other aspects of what you said, those other 3 points, I broadly would agree. I think Jeremy, however, you were a little unkind to Jeremy when you contrasted his position with that of Habermas. Jeremy, of all people, I think has done a lot of wonderful work recognizing similarities in the later Habermas and Popper's work on deliberative the deliberative sessions, deliberative space. But maybe that's something I better leave to Jeremy to respond to. I hope that was okay, Jeremy, in my response.
Yeah. We're already over time, but I think we should give people the possibility to ask a question. Like John Rock is waiting already a long time.
He's been waiting for Hegel, and Jerome got in before John.
Yeah, John.
On the Hegel question, but then there's Bill Bergson as well. Hey, Bill.
I guess as a response to Jeremy, Hegel's idea of corporatism was in fact taken up. It was taken up by Mussolini and then the Austrian clero-fascists who destroyed Austrian democracy in 1934. So there's some historical points of departure. No, but also the question, Jeremy said earlier something that Popper wasn't interested or developing participatory democracy so much, but he always talks so exaltingly about the great generation of Pericles and Socrates. And if he talks that way, is he not sort of pointing the direction towards a kind of direct democracy? What do you think he might have meant by referring over and over again to the great generation? That's for Jeremy and Philip, yeah. The great generation of Pericles.
Can I launch in on the Athenian model? I think it is interesting that he in fact, all of the first volume of the Open Society is devoted to the Athenian model in effect, and that is the standard by which he then assesses Marx in the second volume, and to a little bit on Hegel. But I think you're right. It is interesting that he points there. That what he finds especially important about Pericles' speech is the notion that, number one, each takes their turn, and number two, that all persons, regardless of their level of their status in society or their expertise, can have a say, at least on the consequences of policy. I think that is Popper's primary acknowledgement of the central strength of democracy, that it permits the ruled to criticize and ultimately criticize the policies of the rulers, of the government, and ultimately to change the government and change the rulers. So I think that is where he gets that. In terms of his references to Socrates, Socrates, of course, is the model for critical rationalism, the model for questioning, for not assuming knowledge, or at least holding that knowledge is more like opinion rather than actual deep divine source of knowledge. And so I think that is where he picks Socrates. He does not really, I think, engage Socrates' political thought such as we have it. I mean, the idea that the true champion of justice does not seek any power for himself, I think is crucial to the Socratic position. What I would refer to as political abstentionism is, in my view, central to the Socratic position, although Popper ignores it entirely. He also seems to, in my view, misinterpret the statements that Plato's Socrates makes with regard to minding one's own business, and also the references to friendship, which I think these are fertile political ideas, political ethical ideas that are almost entirely neglected by Popper when he treats Socrates and Socrates' attitude to democracy. By the way, his view of the persuade and obey doctrine is also interesting. It's interesting as what it reveals about Popper. The persuade or obey doctrine assumes that where we have an opportunity to persuade decision makers, we are bound by the rule, the ultimate decision made there. But in the absence of an ability to persuade, to protest, to express our views and our discontent with policy, that's when you have a possibility of tyranny, and where the extra democratic or non-democratic methods become available. He doesn't fully unpack that persuade or obey comment, and he treats it rather, in my view, rather naively and his treatment. But anyway, there is my quick response, I think, to that. Maybe you offered it to Jeremy as well. I'm not sure. Do we have time for Jeremy as well? Coming back, or should we go to Bill?
Maybe we should get to Bill now.
Okay, I'd love to also talk about
yeah, but we will see if there is still time.
May I interrupt? I think
yes.
we should continue the conversation and let Jeremy respond, because I think this is really important. And
okay, we let him respond.
We have another 40 minutes, basically.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. 50. Okay, but okay,
okay,
Jeremy, do you want to respond?
Okay, I'd just make two comments. First of all, I would commend to people as a starting point Habermas's structural transformation of the public sphere, and effectively say the task we have before us is to reconstitute a public sphere within which proper rational criticism can take place, and to find ways in which individuals' critical opinions can feed into this, rather than just having a kind of cacophony. And I think, I mean, if you look at the literature on classical democracy, then, and indeed it stretches through not just Greece, but also Rome, up through the church councils, then basically it gives you a kind of foretaste of Facebook and things worse. What Popper goes for is some of the good ideas that were put forward then, but the actual conduct of democracy by citizens was enough to give anyone the willies. So it seems to me really that those people who don't distinguish between democracy in the sense of our being able to change governments, and also for individuals to be able to voice criticisms. And on the other side of it, the point that Popper also makes, namely that while we can't all formulate policy, we may be able to criticize it. This was made, actually, I was reading recently by by Beatrice Webb, as in part a justification for Fabian elitism. So all I'd say is one has to enter the critical argument here rather than just saying democracy is good and therefore the more of it we can have, the better.
Yes, I agree.
Okay, now it's finally Bill Bergson's time.
Yes, I just wanted to mention about Popper and Jews and Judaism. Agassi knows a lot more about the text than I do, but my impression, and he can correct me, is that Popper, first of all, he was very kind to me, and I was a Jew, and Agassi is also, and he was very kind to both of us, I believe, as students. But his comments, written to me are anti-Jewish and are not justified by some kind of, hostility to groups generally, and, as if treating everybody equally or whatever, because he does not say the same thing about Christianity. He does not criticize Christianity or Islam or Hinduism in the same way that he criticizes Judaism, I believe. But Jaska, you can correct me.
Let me add at once that I said to Popper, you discuss Christianity 1 and Christianity 2, but you discuss only Judaism. You should discuss Judaism 1 and Judaism 2. And he said, I'll do it in the next edition of the Open Society. And he did not.
Yes. Okay.
Any further point on that, Bill? Or no? Okay. Can I? I mean, is it something anybody wants to look at with respect to Popper's view on Hegel? I mean, that was mentioned at the beginning and then at various points subsequently, but we didn't actually fully engage with that. Is that interesting, or would you? John Rock has his hand up. I think. Yeah,
John Rock. You want to say something?
I understand you've done a lot of work on the Popper's reading of Marx. Yeah, I've been doing a lot on it recently as well. And it seems to me that Popper's interest was to sort of purify Marx of all the Hegelian elements within him, and sort of crystallize a kind of or distill a kind of humanitarian rationalist out of Marx. I was wondering if you might want to comment on that motif.
So I think he takes the crucial and most admirable part of Marx to be the view of praxis, the view that we are engaged with our environment by, as we change it, we learn from it, and we develop our ideas through our practice. He rejects the previous materialist approaches, and he rejects also the idealist approaches that had hitherto dominated philosophy. So that is a part of Marx that Popper particularly admires. He admires essentially what is in the third thesis on Feuerbach, and also, of course, in the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, an emphasis on activism, on changing the world, and of learning as we change and developing our ideas about what we want and how we are to live through our praxis, rather than these being set or evolving in a kind of internal bubble without any direct connection with
May I add something to this? Yes.
In
his Grundriss, Marx discusses a fully automated plant. In Capital, this does not occur, and for the simple, obvious reasons that in such a plant, there is no room for exploitation.
It's all occurred before, Yossi. Who makes the automated machines? Workers. Who makes the things that are needed to refurbish the machines? The workers. I mean, do not imagine that automation removes exploitation or wage labor. It merely displaces it elsewhere. Just as automating agriculture merely transfers the farm workers to the factories. You know,
no, this is not true. Every time we invent a robot, we reduce the work load.
I am not sure that certainly there has been a reduction in the total amount of working hours, although in the United States that's sometimes difficult to see. But I think, and we live a lot better, I think, than had existed. But there is a reallocation or reconfiguration of the labor force, I think, and what appears to be, you know, so agriculture is an interesting example of this, I think, where the farm workers now work in factories, or they work designing the machines that are built in factories, but they still exist as in other areas as employed. No doubt we're all better off as a result of that, and I would agree with that. I've lost the thread of the where we were going with this, but so the third and 11th thesis of Marx's theses on Feuerbach, I think, are particularly interesting to Popper, and that's his point of departure to a very large extent. He certainly, it is this disentanglement of Marx and the humanitarian and activist part of Marx from the Hegelian legacy. And I think Popper was right on that. I think, by the way, that's also a theme that you have in Bernstein and in the revisionist socialists that preceded Popper. This notion that Hegel had.
It's fine.
Yeah, so you have this
discussion going on between socialism and free market a little bit in Popper.
Anyway, shall we? Anyway, is there some other way in which you wanted to discuss? I mean, my view of Hegel as a contributor to ideas, I think some of his ideas are very interesting, but a lot of them are not. And I think Popper was right to condemn Hegel in many of aspects of his writing. I think he, especially in the philosophy of right, tries to incorporate liberal slogans and some of the spirit of the end of the 18th century in the service of Prussian absolutism. And Popper is right in his central disparagement of Hegel for that particular area. There are some aspects of the philosophy of right that are very interesting. He does introduce jury trials, for example, at a time when Prussia did not have them. He does talk about the emancipation of the Jews and indeed civil equality among all religious and other minorities within Germany.
Yeah.
So there are some very positive aspects of that. But anyway, I keep hearing other voices, so maybe I should stop.
I think Sadia is just not muted. She's on the phone, I think. So maybe somebody could mute her.
Okay.
I'm sorry about that.
Any additional observations on this?
If I may make a couple of comments, I can't resist. There's all the discussion about Popper and how far that Popper went, and I see Jeremy putting his hands to his head, and maybe he knows what I'm going to say. Popper made a big deal, and Jeremy may have worked on that book on making a distinction between the third descriptive function and the fourth argumentative function. And my understanding was this is something where we need to really talk about the educational systems and how our educational systems are working. And that is very much part of this entire discussion about a mixed economy and how well that mixed economy is working. And Jerome made a comment on market forces versus market transactions. And I think, Philip, you were a little bit too quick to dismiss that comment, because there are very, very different types of market transactions. And some, like healthcare transactions, if you're with the wrong doctor, the wrong hospital, you're dead. So yes, there we need some other institution to guarantee the quality. But many of the other transactions, we don't need institutions to kind of come and police them, because they're of a nature that the market can't take care of itself. And so then I see here an opportunity. The three world view, the way I make sense of it is that there's 7 point 9 billion versions of World 2. So this whole idea of equality or equal, that is an illusion. We're 7.9 billion differences, and the intriguing thing is that we're actually able to communicate with one another, and that gets us back to Popper's arguments about the fourth argumentative function, who very mysteriously is not really discussed in the academy. And I would like to make here a plug for a gentleman he's not here. His name is Godfrey Tangwa. He works in Cameroon. This is a Francophone Popperian, and he actually picked up on that fourth argumentative function and wrote about it. And interestingly, he got his education in Nigeria, just that he picked up on Popper there. And finally, I would like you to leave with this paper, Language and the Body-Mind Problem. Dus that Popper, that's published in Conjectures and Refutations. And there Popper takes up a question of Hayek, that he thinks that Hayek is leaning too much in the direction of artificial intelligence. And that paper that Elise has narrated as an audio, dus that is Popper who has this conversation with Hayek, and then eventually he gives a presentation somewhere, and then it eventually gets published. And now what is very interesting, there are two commentaries on that paper, one by Edward Facer and the other one by Jack Berner. And so Jack Berner takes the view of Hayek, and he says that Hayek could have invented artificial intelligence if he had been at the meeting where Herbert Simon and all the other ones were. And then Edward Facer says, no, I think Popper is the one who understood what the problem was with Hayek. So in summary, I want to just remind that there is this educational component that was touched on earlier, and Luli, I don't know whether she's here, but that is really where we are being prepared, so to say, to have a good mixed economy, or to have a crony predatory capitalism, or alternatively a predatory socialism, or a well-functioning socialism. So we really need to have some discussion about how our educational systems are working. Thank you. Yeah.
I think you're right in many respects, but I would suggest Popper's preference would be for there to be laissez-faire in education. I think that was interesting. His preference for the sophists, in which he included, by the way, very strangely, he included Socrates, even though Socrates never charged his students for anything. So my view is that laissez-faire education for the masses, for the general population, would be something that you could only achieve in my understanding of socialism. That in a market economy, in a capitalist economy, what you have by and large in the education system for the vast majority of people is a preparation for subordinate wage labor positions. It is essentially a system preserving process for the majority, and that includes the way the school day is organized. That includes the way, and we're talking about high school and before, and in terms of the often uncritical approaches that is cultivated necessarily in such a system. But you know, I'm all in favor of a kind of laissez-faire approach, which I think is one of the things that you could achieve in a genuine socialist system. I'm not quite sure what you mean by a predatory socialist system. Maybe you mean where the state owns the capital and exploits wage labor in that context. But anyway. So
yes, and Phil, if I may add quickly, this education or the university is a separate institution from the market. So whatever is happening in education, I'm never saying, it's either the market or it is the state. It's a completely separate institution, and that we need to learn to think more about it as a separate institution. And I think that Popper, and Jeremy said here something very interesting. So his wife Lady Popper wanted him to work on the philosophy of physics, while he should have paid attention to his more social science philosophy, and then this issue would have been resolved or be more clearer, perhaps.
Luke, who goes next? Is it Jeremy or I see Sam, who hasn't previously spoken, at least not in my, not here. So, would he go next or would Jeremy?
I think Jeremy was first. I just had a quick question to the previous sort of Margareta, but yeah, I will let Jeremy take the floor.
Okay, thanks very much. I just want to get back in terms of something that Philip was saying. Popper, there is indeed a strand of activism in Popper, but it seems to me to be highly problematic, particularly because he doesn't, I mean, if one was concerned with matters in the physical sciences or engineering, you wouldn't act prior to being informed by our best fallible knowledge. In the social sciences, Popper's attitude seemed to be, you should just do piecemeal social engineering. And it seemed to me that if one takes such a view, it basically is disregarding what we can learn from fallible theoretical social science. And it's interesting that Peter Muntz, in one of his books, reports briefly on Popper talking to him about Hayek's Road to Serfdom and kind of complaining about it and saying, no, we should have piecemeal social engineering, which seems to me to be roughly on the level of saying, well, they disregard this stuff that says that we can't have a perpetual motion machine. Let's get back to the attitudes of Popper's master in carpentry, cabinet making, who thought that he could construct one. So that whole notion of activism unconstrained by fallible theory seems to me to be a significant strand in Popper and to be utterly pernicious.
I'm sorry, Jeremy, I mean, I find this very strange. I mean, surely it's precisely the criticism of activism without fallibilism that he's making in the open society. It is a criticism of uncritical activism.
May I mention that in the Constitution of Liberty, Hayek calls people who believe in checks and balances naive. He doesn't name them. And Popper does the same way. He doesn't name people who speak about unchecked capitalist markets. I think it is a shame on both Popper and Hayek that they don't name each other as a target of criticism. This shows their failure of their faith in critical philosophy.
Well, I think an element of this was really that each of them had a kind of personal admiration for the other, and I mean, on Popper's part, one can document that he just felt so grateful to Hayek for various things that he didn't want to talk in public about the respects in which he was in disagreement with him, whereas Hayek, I think, constantly misidentifies ideas that he has as being in line with various ideas of Popper's, so that in the introduction to the new edition of Law, Legislation and Liberty, just about to hit the bookshelves, too late, alas, for Christmas presents, I discuss the way in which Hayek tends to equate an open society and use Popper's terminology when he's actually talking about an extended market order and the legal system he thinks should go with it.
Certainly, my point is in accord with what you say. Plato says in the Gorgias that people consider criticism hurt, whereas it is support. This is the thesis of the Gorgias. And Popper always said that criticism is beneficial and one should be grateful for it. But when you dared criticize Popper, you saw something different.
Everyone else is fallible.
No, yeah. I think now it's Sam has turn, finally.
Yes, that was very nice in your discussion. I feel like I've missed the majority of this conversation, but I just heard Margarita make this point that certain institutions cannot be free market institutions, because if we use them, we might sometimes, as he said, use the wrong hospital, and then that will result in our death. And I wanted to ask her, and I think maybe other people as well, like that doesn't seem quite right to me, because there are other institutions which, if we use them, equally result in our death. Like if I buy the wrong kind of car, or if I go bungee jumping from a cliff at a kind of tourist company which is very incompetently organized, then that might also result in my death. And yet we do not think that those organizations or institutions should be centralized in, say, the way that healthcare is. So I thought I would raise that as a critical question and see what people, or Margarita in particular, had to reply.
We should
Yes,
first ask Philip, but yeah, okay.
Yeah, since to clarify, it was part of an earlier conversation in which Jerome had made a distinction between market forces and market transactions. And Jerome's point was that there is a difference, like you say, between bungee jumping, buying chewing gum, buying a bike, buying a car, and then buying a heart operation or a knee replacement. And the point that I was trying to make is, if you are having a heart attack, you just don't go to the market and you say, oh, let's see who is the surgeon here, and then you get people that take care of you. To make it possible for the institution to be there, and in this case is healthcare, there is a lot of planning necessary that actually started 100 years earlier, so to say, because all the technologies that we have today, they started literally 100 years ago when people started thinking about it. And it was to point out, not to say it's either the market or it's something else, is to say there are unique institutions that are like none of the above, that have their own dynamic. And that we should not try to say it's either the market or something else. No, we should kind of try to think, okay, what is the organization delivering as a value? And what I was trying to say is that Popper has a lot of fertile ideas in him that we haven't explored yet. And one of them is that argumentative function that may seem very simplistic if we just read it. But once you start thinking about it, then it becomes actually an argument that I think we really need to explore further, and that we're now, as a society, we're still at a descriptive function, and we haven't fully understood what is involved with the argumentative function. And that somehow goes back to what Professor Agassi was saying. We're still a little bit afraid to argue with one another, and even Popper himself was a little bit afraid. And I think that Jeremy kind of said that at his wife, at Lady Popper, told Popper it's okay to do social philosophy and you need to do more social philosophy, then maybe we might have seen a different Popper.
Right, that makes sense. Yeah, I had the feeling like I was missing some, missing a previous conversation. I don't know if Philip has anything to add to my comments. If so, I would be quite interested.
I mean, I think, well, there were two areas. First of all, certainly what could be argued regarding healthcare could certainly be argued regarding cars, automobiles, etc., and many other processes. And indeed, you have all sorts of interesting checks and balances on those industries as well, don't you? You have all sorts of health and safety and road safety requirements, and indeed in education, whether it's public education run by the state or whether it's in private hands. Again, there are regulatory bodies and inspectorates and what have you to secure certain common standards. So it seems to me that society has those in place, and that is necessary to the market in those various lines of production. All of them in that sense have an element of being commodified, being treated as something that is bought and sold. And I think the chewing gum that you might buy casually, that also is regulated. It strikes me as something that the state necessarily has had to step in order to preserve the market economy. You cannot have a market economy without the state. And if you try and abolish the state just to have a market economy, the state magically reappears in corporate guise with you have all these interesting private courts and private security operations, which I think are just waiting in the wings for the further diminishment of the state in those respects. Was that, Sam, what you specifically wanted me to respond to, or did
yeah, basically, although I think there's still, like, people don't argue for kind of centralization of, say, the automotive industry in the way that they do for healthcare. But I agree with you that we need a system of law to ensure free market transactions and to ensure that there is something like a free market, really. But yeah, I guess my point was more that there's a demand for centralization and regulation in healthcare that there isn't for other institutions, but I don't really see why that's justified with this particular argument, because you can apply it to most industries.
Yes.
And yeah, sorry.
But if I may suggest, if you do not have access to health, you are further disadvantaged in our society. Cars, television sets, although they can explode and get interactions, there's not the same direct relation to human need. I mean, the survival of the working class healthcare is atrocious in almost every darn country you go to, whether it's centralized services or whether it's provided at great expense in the United States. Dentistry, you could argue, the neglect of childhood access to adequate dental care, especially in very poor areas, deeply impacts the educational and other development of children and perpetuates poverty in those areas. You could argue that there is a very important need for some, at least for part of a concern of a public policy agenda with healthcare, with promotion of healthcare, that is related directly to the most fundamental rights of citizens in a society that seeks to be just. And
yes.
that wouldn't apply to certain other transactions, I think.
Yes. Could I reply to that, or I imagine there's still other people who have the hand raised, and I don't want to infringe on their time.
Maybe first we go to Sadia, and then we come back. Okay, Sam.
Yeah, fair enough.
Okay, Sadia.
Yeah, I was going to make a related comment, and you kind of covered that with the education. Because again, the not just having public education as an option, but as kind of a compulsory component. Some people look at it as more kind of socialistic, but at the same time, I feel like, in a democracy, there is a great need. Like, if we expect that people are going to vote on certain important things, we expect them to be kind of well-informed on our best theories. The other thing is, unless if we were able to solve the problem of how to not get our, general public to be indoctrinated by their families, then I see a value in public education. So this is something that I kind of struggle with that I see amongst critical rationalists who seem to take more of a libertarian approach, that they see somehow as public education as coercion, and how dare we, put our children through it, and we should give them. And there's some people I've heard who've gone as far as saying we should let the kids decide what they want to learn. But anyways, I'm kind of curious what you guys think. What are the thoughts? Because I do see a value in some sort of a curriculum that we together decide. It's not about teaching them facts, but it's about exposing them to our best theory and also showing how they keep changing. And anyways, I'll stop at this point.
So may I begin to respond? Yeah, I mean, it helps to have literacy. It helps to have access by the individuals to the basic information that might be in contention in society. And I don't mean to disparage school teachers at all. When I said in my comments before, I think public education and a common education standards are very important. However, ideally, we would want much more opportunity for students to develop their own curiosity and to pursue their intellectual interests so that they educate themselves and so that they develop very different ideas than perhaps their teachers, who are unable to see the problems that they are able to perceive and unable to find the solutions, therefore, that they may creatively come up with. I am very much in favor of moving to that model if we can, but I also recognize that in a capitalist society, you have, contrary to what some libertarians seem to think, you have actually a necessity in a capitalist society for a kind of inculcation of subordination, of workplace discipline, of work ethic that comes down the management line, an ability to master the skills and the curricula that is currently relevant to the needs of capitalism rather than the curiosity of the individuals. So capitalism itself, in my view, market society in itself, imposes restrictions on education, and contrary to the libertarian approach, actually defeats, for most people, not for some, but for most people, opportunities to pursue their curiosity in a kind of deschooled or homeschooled environment. With respect to Sadia's point on families and possibly having public education counter trans, this is something I struggle with, because I see parental autonomy as one of the features I would like to preserve and enhance in some respects in a socialist or open society.
Once you say in some respects, you beg the question.
Well,
in
let me
some
explain.
respects.
So parents have to be allowed to make their own errors in parenting, because it's kind of, instead of it being genetic recombination providing diversity, there is wonderful variation of ideas in the different results of our mistakes that we make in parenting, and it produces a much more pluralistic and differentiated culture, for want of a better term. You have all that.
If I may add, all you need is really what Janusz Korczak said, to recognize every individual's right for respect, regardless of age.
Yes. I think that is the first rule, that you respect other people's dignity and autonomy and self-development. But the second rule also has to then come along and recognize that children are not yet always autonomous, and whereas one would intercede when an adult seeks to harm or may have actions that result in harm to others, but one ought to respect their ability to harm themselves if they so choose.
Listen, Korczak said that old people and sick people also have defects in their autonomy, and you should look at children like you look at old or fragile people.
So paternalism is applicable definitely to children and those perhaps who are childlike. Would that be where you would go for that? Okay, I see a couple of hands up, so I better.
Yeah, Jerome now, probably. Jerome?
Yes, also that's always a very interesting discussion just now between Joseph Agassi and Philip Benesch on the topic that Sophocles, of course, puts in Oedipus's mouth when he speaks to the Sphinx. So thank you for Margareta, by the way, for making my point better than I did. And just to put a line under that, I put a link in the chat with actually discussion of, and then a link also to the article by Kenneth Arrow, famous economist who wrote about the healthcare economy and suggested that healthcare is not a normal good. Moving beyond the discussion of Arrow, I would just ask, what kind of good is it then? And in this context, for me, very useful name that I have not heard here at all, also maybe in a similar sort of area as Popper, is Karl Polanyi and his notion of a fictitious commodity. And I think using topics or concepts like that is a very useful approach to talking about a lot of these issues, including education. Yeah, I like Sabia's point about education, bringing that in, seeing that as well, in my opinion, is a very critical aspect of democracy. You cannot have democracy if you don't have education. And just for me, I'll try to make my point short. I think the metaphor that Peter Berger had of, he had this notion of religious secularism at one point. Religion is going away, and suddenly he changed his view. Actually, we have pluralism. And I think this notion of pluralism is a very useful one, even talking about education and what it is and how it should be like. Socrates described himself as a midwife, helping others to birth their ideas. I think that's a good framing. Of course, maybe it's a little bit rhetorically mischievous. Maybe he was putting things in people's mouths. Paulo Freire's notion of getting beyond this active-passive relationship and the teacher learning from the student as much as the student learns from the teacher. And I think also the connection to science, science as a social process, and looking at things like, Kuhn talked about paradigms or thought collectives as Ludwig Fleck did, and even Popper's notion of the context of justification as, of course, something that moves over time. We weren't talking about social media and ethics, 10 or 15 years ago. So this is a topic now. So anyway, that's a lot of stuff. Maybe I'll stop.
I agree with everything Joram said, so I'm not going to comment.
Okay, we go. Maybe
I think,
first,
unless there's something I should disagree with, Joram.
maybe Jeremy. Jeremy is muted. He just went somewhere. So we go to Sam back now. Sam, you want to ask something more?
Yeah, so in reply to the point that we might want healthcare because it puts people at a particular disadvantage if they are deprived of healthcare. Well, it's a moral argument that you could make, but then the question is really, is that more efficient? Like if televisions were much more beneficial for people than they are now, to the point where if people were deprived of TV, for whatever reason in this fictional universe, when people are deprived of TV, they are at a particular disadvantage. It would not make it more efficient to produce televisions through centralized planning. So again, I don't think that is a particular reason for more regulation in that area.
But I mean,
if I may respond, because I just feel an itch. The problem is the following. If you assume you have this operation and it's like a triple bypass, and what do you believe? That there should be some mechanism in place to make sure that your surgeon is not an alcoholic who's covering it up or who is bullying all the nurses around him, and that people choose not to say anything or they're just afraid because they will get fired. And so the alternative would be that you have these other institutions who do an effort to do checks and balances. And so the point is really to acknowledge the autonomy of several institutions, not just two, but several that check each other, so that if one is failing, that the others are still there to kind of make sure that that surgeon is not entering the room and forgets to wash his hands, and that there might be complications. And this is different from buying a car. I mean, so that's why healthcare is treated as something special. And the other point I wanted to make, that literally takes 100 years to get to that point. So you cannot just say, okay, we destroy the institution and we start from scratch, because it is knowledge that requires a lot to develop over time.
Well, that's true of most things. I mean, basically all our knowledge is dependent on other knowledge which has been in the making for hundreds of years, if not thousands. Like our knowledge to build televisions is intricately tied to quantum theory and all kinds of other things. So I'm not sure I get final point exactly.
Fair enough regarding the final point. Maybe that was not necessary. Yeah.
We go back to Jeremy now.
Thanks
Jeremy?
very much. I'm afraid when I think I was about to be called and the entire thing crashed from my point of view. I don't know if it was God telling me no, for God's sake, but still, just a couple of points. First of all, with regard to Philip, I would be interested in what your economic views are. I mean, you invoked in your book and then in your contribution stuff about exploitation of labor, but I really found what you were saying just baffling. I mean, I don't think there's anything special about labor power. And on the face of it, I'd have thought that all kinds of things, useful or not so useful, can follow as a result of what people do. And it may be something that someone has an idea about themselves. It may be where they're basically executing other people's ideas in a similar kind of way. I mean, you were claiming there is a clash between self-development, for example, in education, and what capitalism requires of us. But in this respect, it seems to me, what you're complaining about is actually one reasonably effective way in which we're channeled to meet the needs of other people. And I just simply don't understand what conception of the workings of a society you have, where people just developing their own ideas and their own ideals will somehow then collaborate to produce what other people want. I mean, there may be a lot behind it, or you may have discussed it elsewhere, but what was coming over seemed to me, I mean, basically, it seemed to me just romantic nonsense. And so I'd like to be directed towards where you have got, where either you or someone else has explicated in a way that, in your judgment, makes cogent sense of that stuff. The other thing is, Margareta took up twice the comment that I made about Henny and wanting to get Popper back to publishing something on philosophy and physics. There was a specific context to this, which is that there had been a projected companion volume to Objective Knowledge with Clarendon Press, which would have brought together various of Popper's papers on themes to do with philosophy and physics, particularly on quantum theory. The problem was that Popper's ideas in these papers differed from one another, that there were also, for example, in his critique of Birkhoff and von Neumann, I mean, eventually it turns out that he was persuaded that he'd actually innocuously misunderstood because of a particular formulation, what was being proposed and so on. And one got to a situation then where I think it would have been impossible for Popper on his own to have worked on this material, or at the very least, he would probably have needed someone who was absolutely on top of current developments in physics to work on it with him. And that wasn't the case. And Henny basically, because I think she, I mean, I don't know why, but certainly she took against the idea of the production of this particular volume, which was very close to what came out as the collection, the method, the framework, basically put on ice something which was pretty much done, I thought, really obtaining a lot of interesting and important material for a project which Popper wasn't in fact in a position to work on in a satisfactory way, and which in the end just got put on one side completely.
All that Lady Popper wanted is for him not to work too hard. Very simple.
I think we're almost out of time, so I won't respond to you, Jeremy.
Yes, yes.
I'm going to let Bill probably have the last word, unless Phil Wood and Bruce wanted to come in. Oh, okay.
Okay, Bill.
Oh, I just wanted to mention or to clarify, Arrow's point about healthcare is not so much about the character of healthcare as a good, but rather the consumer's information concerning healthcare. These idealized competitive markets assume perfect information and assume infinite time. And the point that Arrow was making is that when we have a health emergency, we don't have time. And, it takes, many, many years for doctors to get their information, and the ordinary person doesn't have it. So because of our lack of information, we need to have additional mechanisms to compensate for that. The market forces will, because of our lack of information, the market forces cannot improve the healthcare market in the way that in other cases markets can improve products. Our knowledge and our time are such that it's not going to make the healthcare market function well, and therefore we need more government intervention. I think that was the concept.
Do you want to reply, Philip?
Respond to that?
Well, I mean, very briefly, because you're almost into the next session. I don't want to intrude on that. But yes, yes and no. I mean, clearly there has been remarkable development of medical technology that is arguably spurred on by the market. But I also, I fully agree with you that there is a need for regulation of that market if you are to have that market. And just as with all the examples that Margarita had given as well regarding healthcare. But I think we're out of time, and I don't want to intrude on the next session.
I just want to say one thing. I wanted to introduce everybody as possible, but we have one special guest today who I've gotten to know this year, and it is somebody from Iraq who is here, Badran Mohammed. Hello, Badran, can you say something? Are you still here?
Yes, hello, that's me.
Yes, and he translated 2 books of Karl Popper and also wrote a book about Karl Popper. How did you become interested in Popper, Badran?
Yeah, thank you. So 8 years ago, I bought the Open Society and its Enemies, but I couldn't understand what Popper means by the Open Society and the concepts in the book.
Did you buy that in Arabic or in?
No, in Kurdish.
In Kurdish.
I read it by Kurdish. After that, then I start my MA, and one of my professors said that why you don't write about Karl Popper, because before that I tried to write my MA thesis on Hegel. But one of the professors of the history department said that if you do not know German language, you cannot write on Hegel, because all of the sources that are written and important sources, it's by German language. So that's why I try to listen to the other philosophers, which is Sarbaz Nabi, and he said that you have to write about Popper, one of the great philosophers of the 20th century. And you can read the books by English. They are all exist in the internet. And I try to obtain the books like The Poverty of Historicism. I read some of his books like The Open Society and its Enemies and The Poverty of Historicism. Then I decided to write about this one, which is we call in here anti-Marxist. After my MA thesis, which is published as a book, and maybe the others not know that, and it's by Kurdish language. Unfortunately, you cannot, I think, read it by this language. And then I translated the poverty of historicism within my MA study. And then All Life is Problem Solving, which is Jeremy Shirmour write the introduction to the Kurdish edition. And I was expressing my gratitude to him. And it was my experience with Popper.
Okay.
But what is distinguish Popper from other philosophers? I think it's that philosophers like before Popper, Marxism, Marcus or Hegel, Plato, what he mentioned in the first book of the first and second volume of the Open Society is that all philosophers try to define the world that no one can absolutely know why we are here and what the future will be. But the philosophers like tell us a lie or tell us their point of view about the future. For example, the future for Marxism is communism that comes, but Popper criticizes those ideas, which is in philosophy of history called historical destiny. Which this destiny, but Popper tells us we
can now, Ferdinand. I can't help it. Okay, I'm so sorry. I wanted to introduce everybody, and I want to thank everybody for being here.